The arrow took Warren Keller in the shoulder before he even saw the ambush, and the world tilted sideways into chaos. He hit the dirt of the pilgrim road hard, gravel biting into his palms, and rolled behind a rain-worn shrine to the old road saints just as a second arrow splintered against the stone where his head had been. 6 bandits poured down from the scrub pines above the road, blades out, and Warren had one thought clear through the ringing pain. He had left his sword hanging over the hearth of his orchard cottage 3 years ago, and he had never once regretted it until this exact moment. Then the war cry came from behind him, low and guttural and utterly without fear, and the world tilted again. She came off the ridge like something poured out of old nightmares and older prayers, a green-skinned woman built like a hammer given legs, twin curved falchions flashing silver-white in the noon sun. She was tall enough to look most men in the eye standing on a wagon bed, shoulders broad and corded with muscle beneath a fitted vest of dark boiled leather that laced up her sternum and left her powerful arms bare to the cold mountain air. Leather trousers, scarred and travel-worn, hugged strong thighs, tucked into high boots crusted with road dust. A braid of black hair, thick as a ship's rope, whipped behind her as she moved, and tusks gleamed white against her lower lip when she opened her mouth to scream again. She did not scream in fear. She screamed because she was about to kill someone, and she wanted them to know it was coming. Warren watched, half blind with pain, as the orc woman cut through the bandits like a scythe through summer wheat. The first man she disarmed with a contemptuous flick of her blade that sent his sword spinning into the ditch, then put her boot into his chest hard enough to fold him around a tree. The second she simply caught by the wrist as he swung, twisted, and threw bodily into the third, so that both of them went down in a tangle of limbs and swearing. The last 3 broke and ran before she reached them, scrambling back up into the pines, and she let them go, chest heaving, chuckling low in her throat like the whole encounter had barely raised her pulse. Then she turned, and Warren got his first real look at her face, and something in his chest that had been quiet and settled for 3 years woke up and would not go back to sleep. She was beautiful in the way a drawn bow is beautiful, all coiled purpose and lethal grace, high cheekbones and a strong jaw, tusks that should have made her fearsome and instead made her striking, eyes the deep amber gold of good whiskey held up to firelight. There was a thin scar through one eyebrow, old and pale, and another along her collarbone that the laces of her vest did not quite hide. "You are bleeding, little farmer," she said, in a voice like gravel dragged over silk, and knelt beside him without waiting for permission, strong fingers already probing the arrow shaft. "Hold still, or I will hold you still." "I'm not a farmer," Warren managed, through gritted teeth. "I keep an orchard. Same thing." She snapped the arrow shaft an inch above the wound with 2 fingers, and Warren's vision went white at the edges. "Only difference is trees do not bleed when you cut them." "Neither do I usually," he gasped. She laughed, short and surprised, like the sound had escaped before she meant to let it. "A joke. Good. Men who joke while dying usually do not die." "Comforting," Warren said. And then the world went soft and gray at the corners, and he did not remember much else of that first hour except the impossible gentleness of her hands as she worked the arrowhead free, and the low, steady rumble of her voice telling him to breathe. "Farmer, breathe. I have not carried you this far only to have you die of bad manners." He woke beneath the eaves of a wayhouse 3 miles up the Pilgrim Road, in a narrow bed with clean linen and the smell of wood smoke and dried lavender, and the first thing he saw was her, sitting in the single chair by the shuttered window, sharpening one of her falchions with slow, patient strokes of a whetstone, watching him with those amber eyes as if she had been waiting for him to wake for some time and had decided not to be impatient about it. "You are awake," she said. "Good. I do not like sitting still." "You could have left," Warren said. His voice came out rough. "I would have made it to the wayhouse eventually." "You would have bled out in the ditch," she said flatly. "I have seen men die of arrow wounds slower and less pleasant than that. I did not feel like watching another one." She set the whetstone down and studied him, unhurried, the way a merchant studies a horse he is deciding whether to buy. "You are not afraid of me." "Should I be?" "Most men are." There was something old and tired beneath the words, something that did not match the easy violence he had watched her deal out on the road. Most men see green skin and tusks and think raider before they think anything else. It is easier that way for them. "I saw a woman save my life," Warren said. "The rest is details." She looked at him for a long moment, unreadable, and then something in her shoulders eased just slightly, like a held breath finally let go. "You are either very brave or very stupid, little farmer." "Warren," he said. "Warren Keller. And I keep an orchard, I told you. 3 days' walk from here, near the border shrine at Pello's Ford." "Grama," she said. "Grama Ashwalker." She said it the way a person sets down something heavy they have carried a long way, testing whether the ground would hold it. "And I am going the same direction as your orchard, Farmer Keller, the border road. I have business there." "What kind of business?" Something shuddered behind her eyes, quick as a closing door. "My own," she said, and picked the whetstone back up, and Warren understood, with the instinct of a man who had spent a decade as a sellsword before he ever planted a single apple tree, that he had just brushed up against a wound far older and far deeper than the one in his shoulder, and that pressing on it now would earn him nothing but her silence. So he did not press. He only watched her hands moving over the blade, sure and practiced, and thought that he had never in his life seen anyone so magnificent, and that he was, quite thoroughly, in trouble. They traveled together after that because the wayhouse keeper, a nervous, round little man named Otzi, who kept glancing at Grama's tusks like they might unhinge and swallow him, made it very clear he did not want either of them lingering, orc or wounded sellsword-turned-farmer, and because Warren's shoulder was not yet fit for solitary walking, and because, if he was honest with himself in the quiet hours before dawn, he did not want her to leave. The Pilgrim Road ran 200 miles from the coastal shrine city of Vesport to the mountain passes of the border country. A rutted track lined every few miles with weathered stone shrines to the old road saints, wayhouses where travelers paid a copper for a bed and a bowl of stew. And increasingly as they climbed toward the highlands, burned-out farmsteads and abandoned watchtowers that spoke of trouble brewing long before either of them had arrived. Warren learned, over 3 days of walking beside her while his shoulder knitted, that Grama Ashwalker had once led a war band of 11, the Ashwalker Band, named for the burned valley they had all been born in, orcs and half-orcs, and the handful of human outcasts who had thrown in with them over the years. He learned this in pieces, reluctantly given, the way a man learns the shape of a wound by pressing gently at its edges. "We were guards," she told him on the second evening when they had stopped at a wayhouse called the Broken Wheel and sat outside beneath the stars because the innkeeper had made it clear, without quite saying so, that he preferred she not sit inside among his other guests. "Caravan guards mostly. Sometimes we took contracts to clear bandit camps or to stand between 2 villages arguing over a boundary stone. Good work, honest work." Her jaw tightened. "We were good at it." "Were," Warren said quietly. "There was a border dispute." She said the words like they tasted of ash. 2 villages, human villages, fighting over a stretch of grazing land near the Karsk River crossing. "We were hired to keep the peace while the magistrates argued about old deeds. Simple work. We had done it 100 times. She stared into the fire Warren had built, and her hands, resting on her knees, curled slowly into fists. "Someone did not want peace kept. Someone burned our camp in the night, while half of us slept and the other half stood watch on a hillside a mile off, watching torches we thought were the villagers' bonfires." Warren did not say anything. He had learned enough already about grief to know it needed room to breathe before it needed comfort. 10 of them," Grama said. 10 of my band, dead before dawn, and me on a hillside with 3 others who lived only because we were too far away to burn with the rest. And then the ones who came for us in the morning, the ones who wanted to finish what the fire started. I lost the last 2 of them defending a crossing they should never have had to defend alone. Her voice had gone very flat, very controlled, the voice of someone holding something enormous behind a very small door. "I am the last of the Ashwalker band, Farmer Keller. 11 of us, and now there is only me, and I am walking this road because I mean to find out who set that fire, and I mean to make them regret that I did not burn with the rest." The fire popped and hissed between them. Somewhere off in the dark, a night bird called twice and went silent. Warren thought of the men he had buried during his own decade of sellsword work, the friends whose names he still said sometimes into empty rooms, and he thought that he understood, at least a little, the particular shape of the thing sitting across the fire from her. "Then you deserve a better kind of war than this one," he said. She looked up at him sharply, amber eyes catching the firelight. "What does that mean?" "It means revenge burns whoever carries it, same as it burned the ones who started the fire that took your band." He kept his voice steady, kept his eyes on hers, because this was not something to say and then look away from. "It means you can spend the rest of your life hunting shadows down this road and call it justice, or you can find something worth fighting for that isn't just paying back a debt in blood, a war worth having, one that builds something instead of just settling a score." He shrugged, and it pulled at his healing shoulder. "You saved my life on that road for no reason except it needed saving. That is not the act of a woman who only knows how to take. You are capable of more than revenge, Grama Ashwalker. I think you know that, or you would not still be walking instead of already killing." For a long moment she said nothing at all. The fire crackled. Then, very quietly, in a voice stripped of all its usual iron, "No one has said my full name like that since the fire, like it belonged to something worth keeping." "It does," Warren said. "It belongs to you." She held his gaze, something raw and unguarded moving behind her eyes, and for one long, suspended heartbeat Warren thought she might reach across the fire and close the distance between them entirely. Then she looked away, back into the flames, and the moment passed. Though it did not disappear, it settled instead into the space between them, a live coal banked but not extinguished. "You talk too much for a farmer," she said, but there was no bite left in it, only something almost soft. "Sellsword before the orchard," he admitted. 10 years. I know the shape of the thing you're carrying better than you might guess." She studied him with new interest. "You do not carry yourself like a soldier." "I carry myself like a man who got tired of digging graves for friends and decided to dig holes for apple trees instead." He managed a small, crooked smile. "Trees don't die on you unless you're careless. Friends die on you no matter how careful you are." "And did it work, the trees instead of the graves?" "Mostly," Warren said. "Some nights it still doesn't, but mostly yes." Grama looked at him for a long time, and something in her expression suggested she was recalculating him entirely, throwing out whatever assumption she had walked into their meeting with and building something new in its place. "Tomorrow," she said finally, "we reach the border country. Pello's Ford and your orchard, and beyond that the Karsk Crossing, where my band died. I would have you know, Farmer Keller, that I do not intend to endanger you further. You have done enough, patching me a place to sit by your fire and speaking truths I did not ask to hear. Once we reach your orchard, our roads part." "Do they?" Warren said, and did not make it a question because he already suspected, with the same instinct that had once kept him alive through a decade of border skirmishes, that whatever waited at the Karsk Crossing was not going to let either of them walk away from each other so easily. He was right, though it took 3 more days to prove it. Pello's Ford turned out to be smaller and more anxious than Warren remembered leaving it. The border shrine at the edge of the ford, a squat stone cairn dedicated to St. Ambry of Safe Crossings, had been vandalized, its offerings scattered and its stone face cracked. The wayhouse keeper, a stout widow named Ferris who had known Warren since he first bought his orchard plot, met them at the edge of town with a crossbow half raised and only lowered it when she recognized his face. "Warren Keller, as I live," she said, eyeing Grama with open suspicion. "You bring strange company these days." "She saved my life on the road," Warren said. "Twice, if you count keeping me from bleeding to death after." Ferris did not look convinced, but she did not raise the crossbow again either. You should know there's trouble brewing worse than road bandits, Warren. The grazing dispute at the Karst crossing has gone from angry words to burned barns. Both villages, Hallow Creek and Marrow's End, are calling up every able body they've got, and there's talk of orc raiders being blamed for the fires, though nobody's actually seen an orc band anywhere near here in 2 years. Her eyes cut back to Grama. Until now, apparently. I am not raiding anyone, Grama said, cold and even. I am looking for the truth of a fire that took my band a year ago at that same crossing. Ferris's face did something complicated: surprise, then wariness, then a grudging, reluctant curiosity. A year ago, she repeated. That would have been right when the dispute first turned ugly. Before that, Hallow Creek and Marrow's End had shared that grazing land peaceful enough for 2 generations. Someone wanted it to stop being peaceful, Warren said slowly, the old sellsword instincts in him turning the pieces over like coins. Someone burned Grama's band's camp to clear them out of the way, and then let the 2 villages tear each other apart over the land, once there was no one left keeping the peace between them. That is a large claim, farmer, Grama said, though her eyes had sharpened with the same thought. It's the kind of claim men made money on back when I did this work, Warren said grimly. Buy up burned land cheap once 2 villages have bled each other white fighting over it. I've seen it done on smaller scales. Someone benefits from that crossing staying a war instead of becoming a peace. Grama's jaw set, tusks catching the afternoon light. Then I will find out who. We will find out who, Warren said, and did not miss the way her eyes flicked to him, surprised, something unguarded flickering across her face before she caught it and smoothed it away. I told you our roads part at your orchard, she said, but there was no real conviction in it now. They can part after, Warren said, or they can not part at all. Your choice, Grama Ashwalker. But I'm not sending you into whatever's waiting at that crossing alone, not after what it already cost you once. She looked at him for a long moment, something warring behind her amber eyes: pride and grief, and something else Warren did not yet have a name for, though he recognized its shape because he felt it too, sitting warm and dangerous in his own chest. You are a strange little farmer, she said at last, to think you have any say in where I walk. I'm not telling you where to walk, Warren said. I'm telling you I'm walking beside you. Those aren't the same thing. Something that was almost a smile touched the corner of her mouth, quick and reluctant. No, she agreed. They are not. They stayed that night in Warren's own cottage at the edge of his orchard, a modest stone and timber place with a good hearth and rows of apple trees behind it, just beginning to show hard green fruit. And if Ferris and the rest of Pello's Ford whispered about the orc woman sleeping under the sellsword-turned-farmer's roof, neither Warren nor Grama paid the whispers any mind. She stood a long while in his orchard that evening, running her calloused fingers over the rough bark of the nearest tree, and Warren watched her from the cottage doorway, struck by how strange and lovely it was to see a woman built for war stand so still and so gentle among growing things. You built this, she said, not quite a question. Planted every tree myself, Warren said, coming to stand beside her. Took the first harvest 2 years ago. Nothing spectacular, just apples. But they're mine, and nobody's shooting arrows at me over them. It is more than that, Grama said quietly. It is proof a life can be built instead of only defended. She looked at him sideways, amber eyes catching the last of the sunset. I did not think men like you existed any more, Farmer Keller. Men who could hold a sword and choose to put it down. I didn't put it down because I was weak, Warren said. I put it down because I got tired of a war that never built anything. I think you understand that better than most. I am beginning to, she admitted, and the words cost her something to say, he could tell, and he loved her a little more for the cost of it, though he did not let himself think the word love directly yet, not with things still so new and so uncertain between them. They set out for the Karst crossing the next morning, and it was there, 3 days later, that the true shape of the trouble revealed itself, and that the story of the Ashwalker band's death finally came due. The Karst crossing sat at the bottom of a steep river gorge, spanned by an old covered bridge of gray timber that had stood, according to the shrine marker at its near end, for over 100 years. A pilgrim's bridge, blessed by 3 generations of road saints, wide enough for 2 wagons to pass abreast. Beyond it, on the far bank, the grazing land in dispute stretched green and lush between the 2 feuding villages, dotted with the black scars of burned barns and, Warren noted grimly, an unusual number of armed men patrolling for a simple pasture dispute. They found the man responsible for it all standing at the near end of the bridge, flanked by a dozen hired swords wearing no village colors at all, a lean, well-dressed merchant named Aldous Petrie, whom Ferris back at the Wayhouse had mentioned only once, in passing, as the man who'd been quietly buying up burned farmland from both feuding villages at bargain prices for the better part of a year. "Well," Petrie said, when he saw them approaching, his eyes sliding over Grama with the particular contempt of a man who had never had to fear anything green-skinned in his life and did not intend to start now. "An orc and a farmer. I was told to expect trouble on this road, but I confess I expected something more impressive." "You burned my warband's camp," Grama said, and her voice was very quiet, very level, and all the more terrifying for it. "A year ago, at this crossing." Petrie did not even have the decency to look surprised. "Your band was hired to keep the peace between 2 villages that were, frankly, more valuable to me at each other's throats. Land bought in grief sells cheap, orc. Nothing personal in it, merely business. 10 of my people burned alive," Grama said, "was merely business to you. 11 actually, if we count the 2 you lost defending this very bridge the following morning," Petrie said, with the casual cruelty of a man who had never once imagined consequences catching up to him. "Though I see you survived. A pity. Loose threads have a way of unraveling entire tapestries if left too long." His men moved at a gesture from his hand, spreading out to block both ends of the bridge, and Warren understood with a cold sellsword's clarity that Petrie had never intended to let either of them leave this crossing alive to tell what they now knew. "Warren," Grama said low, already drawing her falchions, "get back." "Not a chance," Warren said, and drew the long knife he kept at his belt, no match for her twin blades or for a dozen hired swords, but a blade all the same, and he would not stand behind her while she fought a battle that had already cost her everything once before. What happened next happened fast, the way real violence always does, nothing like the slow drama of a bard's tale. Petrie's men came at them from both ends of the bridge at once, and Grama met the first 3 with a speed that seemed to bend the very air around her, blades flashing, driving them back toward the bridge's timber railings. Warren fought at her back, giving ground when he had to, using the narrow confines of the covered bridge to keep from being surrounded, taking a shallow cut along his forearm that he barely felt through the roaring focus of combat. Then one of Petrie's men, or Petrie himself in a fit of panic spite, no one would ever be entirely sure which, put a torch to the old dry timber at the bridge's near support, and the ancient wood, 100 years dried by mountain sun and untouched by rain beneath its covered roof, caught with terrifying speed. "The bridge!" Warren shouted, as flame raced up the support beam and along the dry rafters overhead, and beneath their feet the whole structure gave a deep, groaning shudder, as though the old bridge itself had decided it had carried enough grief across its span and meant to be done with the world entirely. "Warren!" Grama's voice cut through the smoke and the roaring flame, and he turned to see her cutting down the last of the swordsmen between them and the near bank. But the fire had already spread behind her, cutting off the path back the way they'd come, and the far bank, where Petrie and his remaining men were scrambling away in open panic, was 100 feet of burning, buckling timber away. The bridge shuddered again, this time with a sound like the world's bones breaking, and a section of railing near the center gave way entirely, dropping into the churning white water of the gorge below with a crash that Warren felt in his teeth. "We cannot reach either bank in time," Grama shouted, amber eyes wide, and for the first time since he had met her, Warren saw real fear on her face, not for herself. He realized with a jolt, but for him. The support beam. Warren shouted back, pointing to a diagonal timber brace that ran from the walkway down toward a rocky shelf jutting from the gorge wall 20 feet below, half hidden by smoke. It'll hold weight if we're fast. That is not a bridge, farmer, that is a plank over a killing drop. It's the only plank we've got. The floor of the bridge gave way beneath them in a shower of burning splinters as he said it, and there was no more time for argument. Warren grabbed Gromma's hand, her fingers closed around his with bruising, desperate strength, and they ran together across the last stable stretch of buckling timber, the whole structure screaming and dropping around them, flame roaring at their backs like a living thing. They hit the diagonal brace at a dead sprint, and Warren felt his footing go out from under him as the beam itself began to tear free of the burning structure above. And then Gromma's arm was around his waist, hauling him bodily against her as she leapt, orc strength and desperate momentum carrying them both off the collapsing beam entirely, out into open air above the white-churned river. They fell together, tangled, Gromma twisting in the air with instinctive, warrior's grace to take the brunt of the impact herself, and struck the rocky shelf in a bone-jarring crash that drove the breath entirely from Warren's lungs, and left his ears ringing with the thunder of the bridge finally collapsing in full behind them. 100 years of timber and stone crashing down into the gorge in an avalanche of flame and smoke and shattered beams, sending up a plume of white water and gray ash that blotted out the sun for a long, terrible moment. Then there was only the roar of the river, and the crackle of the last flaming debris hissing out in the current, and the frantic, desperate sound of Gromma's voice saying his name over and over, hands roaming over his ribs and shoulders checking for breaks with a rough, terrified tenderness that told him more clearly than any words could have exactly how much he had come to matter to her. Warren, Warren, look at me. Are you broken? Tell me you are not broken. Not broken, Warren managed, coughing smoke, staring up at her face hovering above his, soot-streaked and fierce and more beautiful to him in that moment than anything he had ever seen. Might have bruised something important, though. You idiot, Gromma said, half a sob and half a furious laugh, and then she did something she had not done once in the 6 days he had known her. She kissed him, hard and desperate and searing, tusks and all, one hand fisted in the front of his shirt like she meant to never let go of it again, and Warren kissed her back with everything he had. Every bit of the want he had been carefully not naming since the first moment he saw her cut through 6 bandits without breaking a sweat. She pulled back just far enough to press her forehead to his, breathing hard, amber eyes bright with unshed tears she would clearly rather die than let fall. I have watched 10 of my warband burn, she said, low and rough. I will not watch you fall into a gorge because you thought yourself brave enough to fight beside me. Do you understand me, Farmer Keller? I will not survive that a second time. Then don't let me fall, Warren said, and reached up to brush a smear of soot from her cheek, his thumb lingering against her jaw. Stay close enough to catch me. I'd say you're already good at that. Something fierce and wondering moved across her face. This is not the war I meant to bring you into. I told you once you deserved a better kind of war than revenge, Warren said quietly. I meant it. This one, though, this one's worth fighting. Petrie's still up there and he's not going to stop just because his bridge did. Gromma's expression hardened, grief and fury and something warmer all braided together. No, she agreed. He is not. They found a way up out of the gorge along a game trail Warren remembered from his sellsword days, emerging a mile downriver, soot-streaked and battered but alive, and made their way to Marrow's End, the nearer of the 2 feuding villages, where Warren's old reputation, a former sellsword who'd kept the peace on this very border a decade past, still carried enough weight that the village elders agreed to hear them out. It took the better part of 2 days to lay it all before them. Petrie's land purchases, the timing of the fire that had killed Gromma's band, the hired swords with no village colors. But between Warren's careful, methodical accounting of the evidence and Grama's raw, unflinching testimony of what had actually happened at that crossing a year before, the elders of both Marrow's End and Hallow Creek came to see, slowly and with considerable shame, how thoroughly they had been played against each other for one man's profit. Petrie did not wait around for a formal reckoning. He fled the border country entirely within the week, taking what movable wealth he could and leaving the rest, and though a small posse of village men rode after him for 2 days, he was never caught. A loose thread left dangling, Warren thought, but not every wound closes clean, and the piece it left behind between Marrow's End and Hallow Creek was real enough that both villages tore down the makeshift barricades they'd built along the disputed grazing land within the month, and began, haltingly, to speak of sharing it again as they always had before the fire. It was not the vengeance Grama had walked that road seeking. But it was, Warren thought, watching her stand at the edge of that reclaimed pasture land with the wind moving through her dark braid, something that looked a great deal like the better war he had promised her. Not blood paid for blood, but a wrong finally seen clearly and set right, and a peace that would outlast the man who tried to profit from its absence. "It is not enough," Grama said quietly that evening, sitting beside him on the low stone wall at the edge of his orchard, 3 days' walk and a lifetime of grief later. "It does not bring back the 10 who burned or the 2 I lost defending that crossing alone." "No," Warren agreed. "It doesn't. Nothing will." Took her hand, calloused and strong and warm in his, and did not let go. "But it means they didn't die for nothing, Grama. That land stays shared, stays peaceful because of what you and I did at that crossing. That's not nothing. That's the whole reason a warband exists in the first place, to make sure the peace holds. You did that, even at the end, even alone." She was quiet a long time, watching the sun go down gold and orange behind his rows of apple trees, heavy now with the season's fruit. "I told you I was the last of my warband," she said finally, very softly. "I remember. I do not think that is true anymore." She turned to look at him, amber eyes steady and open in a way he had not seen from her before, no walls left standing behind them at all. "A warband is not only blood, Farmer Keller. It is who stands beside you when the fire comes. I have found that again. In you." Warren's throat went tight. "Grama, do not make it a small thing by arguing with me about it," she said, though her mouth had curved, soft and unguarded, into something that was almost a smile. "I have decided. It is decided." "I wasn't going to argue," Warren said. "I was going to say I'd be honored." That startled a real laugh out of her, low and warm, the sound of it settling into his chest like sunlight. "Honored," she repeated. "You are a very strange man, Warren Keller. You already told me that, twice, I think. It bears repeating." She leaned into him then, solid and warm along his side, her head coming to rest against his shoulder in a gesture so simple and so trusting that it undid something in him more completely than the kiss on the bridge had. "I did not think I would want anything again after the fire. I did not think there would be room in me for it. And now. Now there is a farmer who talks too much, and an orchard full of apples I have not yet tasted, and I find I am no longer in such a hurry to leave either one behind." She tilted her head to look up at him, and whatever she saw in his face made her expression soften further, something fierce and tender warring behind her eyes. "I want you, Warren Keller. I have wanted you since you made a joke while an arrow was still in your shoulder. I did not let myself say it because I thought I had nothing left to offer a man like you but grief and a war I could not win alone. But you have shown me a better war. I would like now to show you something better than grief." Warren's heart was hammering hard enough he was fairly certain she could feel it through his shirt. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "Not from you. I decided that back on the road, somewhere around the second time you called me an idiot. Only the second time. I lost count after the bridge." She laughed again, and this time when she kissed him it was slow, unhurried, no fire or desperation behind it, only warmth and certainty and the particular sweetness of 2 people who had already survived the worst a road could throw at them and found, on the other side of it, something worth staying for. They did not rush what came after. There was a tenderness to the weeks that followed the fall of the bridge and the fall of Petrie's schemes, Grama staying on at Warren's cottage at the edge of the orchard, at first in the guise of resting from her wounds. And then, as autumn came on gold and slow through the apple trees, simply because neither of them wished to imagine the cottage without her in it. Ferris at the Wayhouse stopped eyeing her with suspicion sometime around the third week. Once word of what had happened at the Karsk crossing spread through Pello's Ford, and by the time the first frost silvered the orchard grass, half the village had come, at one point or another, to bring Grama some small gift, a jar of preserves, a length of good wool, an apology, unspoken but understood, for every wary glance she'd been given on first arriving. It was on one of those cold, clear autumn nights, with the harvest mostly in and the cottage warm with hearth fire, that Grama finally told him the rest of what she had carried since the fire. The names of the 10 who had burned, spoken slowly and carefully, like a woman laying stones for a memorial, and the names of the 2 who had died defending the crossing beside her, and Warren listened to every one of them without interrupting, because he understood, better than most men could, that some griefs only ever heal by being spoken aloud to someone who will not flinch from hearing them. When she finished, she was quiet a long while, staring into the fire, and then she reached into the collar of her vest and drew out something she had never shown him before, a small iron medallion, crudely stamped with a stylized ash tree threaded on a leather cord. "This was the sigil of my war band," she said. "Each of us wore one. I took mine from the fire, the only thing I salvaged before I fled the ridge that night." She turned it over in her strong fingers, firelight catching the old, worn metal. "I have carried it a year, meaning to bury it somewhere fitting. Once I found who was responsible and made them pay for it in blood." She looked up at him, something new and resolved in her amber eyes. "I do not think I want to bury it in blood anymore, Warren. I think I would rather plant it." Warren's breath caught. "Plant it. In your orchard." She said it simply, like it was the most obvious thing in the world, though he could see the vulnerability underneath the words, the risk she was taking in offering something so precious to a life so new. Beneath a young tree, so that something grows from it instead of nothing. "I would like my warband's memory to belong to a place that builds, not only a place that mourns." She hesitated, and for the first time since he'd known her, Grama Ashwalker looked almost shy. "If you would permit it, it would mean this place becomes as much mine as it is yours." "Grama." Warren had to clear his throat before he could get the rest out. "This place has been half yours since the day you walked into it. You don't need to plant anything to make that true. But I would be honored, genuinely, deeply honored, to help you bury that medallion beneath one of my trees." They did it the next morning, beneath the youngest sapling in the orchard's east row, the 2 of them digging side by side in the cold ground. And when it was done, Grama stood a long while with her hand pressed flat to the disturbed earth, murmuring something low and guttural in the old orc tongue that Warren did not understand but recognized, by its cadence, as a kind of prayer, or perhaps a farewell, or perhaps both at once. When she straightened, there were tears on her face, unashamed and unhidden for the first time since he'd known her, and Warren simply pulled her into his arms and held her until the shaking stopped, the 2 of them standing together in the cold morning light among the bare branches of an orchard that had, without either of them quite planning it, become a shared home. Winter came on hard and early that year, snow piling deep against the cottage walls, and it was during one of the long, quiet nights of that first winter together, with the fire banked low and the wind howling soft against the shutters, that their careful tenderness finally gave way entirely to the heat that had been building between them since the very first night by the fire on the Pilgrim Road. It began, as most true things between them had, with an argument, Grama insisting she could repair the cottage's storm-damaged roof herself, Warren insisting just as stubbornly that he would not have her climbing icy timber in the dark on his account, both of them raising their voices in the small, warm space of the cottage, until the argument dissolved, as it so often did between them, into something else entirely, a look held too long. a hand reaching to steady the other that lingered instead of letting go. And then Grama's mouth was on his, fierce and certain, and there was no more talk of roofs or storms at all. She undressed him slowly, for a woman who did everything else in her life with brisk, decisive speed, her calloused fingers tracing old scars on his chest with a reverence that made his breath catch, murmuring something low against his skin about how she had wanted him since long before she had let herself admit it, even to herself, back on a smoke-hazed road with an arrow still lodged in his shoulder. Warren answered her with his own hands, mapping the powerful lines of her, the old scar at her collarbone, the strength in her that had never once made him feel small, only chosen, only wanted beyond anything he had let himself hope for in the 10 lonely years since he'd first picked up a sword. What passed between them that night was neither hurried nor gentle in the careful way of strangers. It was hungry and certain and deeply, achingly tender all at once, firelight moving warm across green skin and old scars alike, her breath catching his name like a vow, his hands finding every place she had never let another living soul touch since the fire took her band, and when it was over they lay tangled together beneath the firs. Her head on his chest and his fingers idly tracing the length of her braid, and Grama said, into the quiet dark, "I did not know it could feel like this. Being wanted, being chosen and not only needed for a blade in my hand." "You're both," Warren said softly. "The blade and the woman. I don't want one without the other. I never did." She was quiet a long moment and then so softly he almost missed it. "Good, because I do not intend to be anything less than both of them for you for as long as you will have me." "That's a long time then," Warren said. "I'm not planning on letting you go." "I was not asking permission, Farmer," Grama said, and he could hear the smile in her voice even in the dark. "I was informing you of my decision." Warren laughed, low and warm, and pulled her closer, and outside the wind howled on against the shutters, and inside the cottage, for the first time in longer than either of them could easily remember, there was nothing but warmth and closeness, and the deep, settled peace of two people who had found, against every hard history their two peoples carried, something worth building a whole life around. Spring came late to the border country, but when it came fast, snowmelt swelling the Karsk River until the ford ran high and loud, and the orchard burst into a riot of white and pink blossom that Grama declared, standing among the trees with her face turned up to the falling petals, more beautiful than anything she had seen on any battlefield or war camp in all her years of soldiering. It was in that same spring, a full year almost to the day since Warren had first taken an arrow to the shoulder on the Pilgrim Road, that the last thread of their story came due, not from Petrie, who was never seen again in the border country, nor from any lingering grief over the Ashwalker band, whose memory had settled over the winter, into something Grama could speak of now with sorrow, but without the raw, jagged edge of that first telling by the fire. It came instead in the form of a courier riding hard up the Pilgrim Road from Vesport, bearing news that the border magistrates, having finally reviewed the full accounting of what had happened at the Karsk crossing, wished to formally commend both Warren Keller and Grama Ashwalker for uncovering Petrie's scheme and restoring the peace between Marrow's End and Hallow Creek, and more than that, wished to offer Grama a standing commission, on behalf of both border villages, to lead a new company of road wardens tasked with keeping the pilgrim route safe from bandits and worse, from Pello's Ford all the way to the mountain passes. She read the letter twice, standing in the orchard with blossom petals catching in her dark hair, and then handed it to Warren without a word, watching his face carefully as he read it himself. "They want you to lead," Warren said slowly when he'd finished. "A whole company, guarding the same road where we met. They want the last of the Ashwalker band," Grama said, "to build a new one." She said it carefully, testing the shape of the idea. "I have thought of little else since the courier arrived." "It is a good offer, Warren. Honest work, the kind I always loved best, and it would mean something, to guard the very road that nearly killed us both, and to do it with my own name and no one else's shadow over it. She hesitated, and something uncertain crossed her face for the first time in months. But it would mean leaving the orchard, leaving this cottage. I do not know if that is a thing I have any right to ask of you. Warren looked at the letter in his hands, and then at her, and understood with sudden and complete clarity that there was no real choice in it at all, not because the orchard did not matter to him, but because it had never been the trees or the cottage that had made this place home. It had been her. I spent 10 years on roads like that one, Warren said slowly, guarding caravans, keeping peace between villages too proud to keep it themselves. I put the sword down because the war I was fighting never built anything lasting. He set the letter down on the low stone wall between them and took both her hands in his, calloused palm against calloused palm. This one would. A safe road from Pello's Ford to the passes, pilgrims and traders and ordinary folk able to walk it without fearing bandits or worse. That's a war worth having, Grama. I told you that once, on a night I didn't think you were listening as closely as it turned out you were. I remember, Grama said softly. I remember every word you have ever said to me, Warren Keller, whether I wished to admit it at the time or not. Then you already know my answer. He squeezed her hands. I'll sell the orchard, or lease it out, or find some way to keep the trees tended even from a distance. Ferris would know someone honest enough for the work. But I'm not sending you down that road without me beside you. Not after everything it's already tried to take from both of us. Something bright and fierce and disbelieving moved across her face. You would leave this place, for me. I already left one life for a quieter one once, Warren said. I can leave a quiet one for a better one if the better one has you in it. That's not much of a sacrifice, Grama. That's just good sense. She laughed then, a real laugh, bright and unguarded, blossom petals catching in her hair as she threw her arms around his neck and kissed him hard enough to steal the breath from him entirely. A better kind of war, she murmured against his mouth, led by the last of the Ashwalker band, and fought at the side of the only man who ever made me want to stop fighting alone. She pulled back just far enough to look at him properly, amber eyes bright with something that looked very much like joy, hard-won and entirely unashamed. I accept their commission, Warren Keller, on one condition. Name it. That you walk that road with me, not as my guard and not as a farmer who happened to stumble into my path, as my equal, as the man I have chosen out of every man and every orc and every soul I have ever met on any road in this world, to stand beside for as long as we both draw breath. Her voice had gone rough with feeling, all her usual iron control given over to something rower and truer. I am done being the last of anything, Warren. I want to be the first of something new, with you. Then that's exactly what we'll be, Warren said, and kissed her again, slow and certain, the orchard blossoms falling soft around them like something out of an old road saint's blessing. And if any of Pello's Ford happened to glance up from their morning work and see the sellsword-turned farmer and the last of the Ashwalker band standing tangled together beneath the flowering trees, none of them thought to whisper about it any more. It had simply become, over the long turning of a hard winter into a gentler spring, the way of things. They left Pello's Ford 3 weeks later, once the lease on the orchard had been settled with a trustworthy young couple from Hallow Creek who'd lost their own farm to the border dispute and were glad of the fresh start. And once Grama's new company of road wardens had begun to take shape, 6 recruits to start, a mix of hardened border country men and 2 young orcs from a peaceable trading clan 2 valleys over. All of them drawn by reputation of the woman who'd uncovered Petrie's scheme, and the farmer who'd stood at her side through fire and flood alike. The morning they set out, the pilgrim road stretched ahead of them gray and long under a wide spring sky, past the shrine to St. Ambry, freshly repaired now with new-cut stone, past the place where the old covered bridge at the Karsk crossing had been rebuilt over the winter, wider and sturdier than before, its timbers still pale and raw with newness. Grama had asked and been granted the honor of naming it, and the small brass plaque fixed to its near railing read, in simple, unadorned letters, "The Ashwalker Crossing, built in memory of a warband and in hope of a better one." Warren walked beside her at the head of their small company, his old sellsword blade, retrieved at last from over the cottage hearth, oiled and sharpened for the first time in 3 years, riding easy at his hip, and Grama walked with her twin falchions at her back and her dark braid catching the morning light, and between them, unspoken but entirely understood, was the whole quiet weight of everything they had survived to reach this particular sunrise. "Second thoughts, farmer?" Grama asked, glancing sideways at him as the road curved up toward the first switchback into the passes, her voice light but her eyes watchful, still half expecting, even now, that he might change his mind about the whole enormous leap he'd made for her. "Not one," Warren said, and reached over to take her hand, lacing his fingers through hers in front of 6 new recruits and every pilgrim they passed on the road, because he had spent too many years being careful with a heart no one had ever fought hard enough to want, and he was not about to start being careful with this one, not when the woman who held it had already proven, a dozen times over, exactly how fiercely she meant to keep it. "Good," Grama said, and there was a whole world of warmth in the single word, amber eyes soft in a way that only he, of everyone she had ever known, ever got to see. "Because I have decided, Warren Keller, that I intend to keep you beside me on every road I ever walk again. You should prepare yourself accordingly." "I already have," Warren said. "Been preparing since the day you called me an idiot and kissed me on a burning bridge." "That was a very good day," Grama said, tusks gleaming in a wide, unguarded smile as the sun rose fully over the mountain passes ahead of them. "Best of my life," Warren agreed, and together, hand in hand, the last of the Ashwalker band and the sellsword who'd found in her the one war worth fighting for, they walked on up the pilgrim road toward whatever horizon waited beyond the next rise, no longer separate travelers thrown together by chance, but something new and whole and entirely their own, a warband of 2, and behind them the beginnings of many more, all of it built, at last, on something sturdier than grief, and wider than any border dispute, and far, far more lasting than the fire that had once tried and failed to end it all. Behind them, the orchard bloomed on without them, tended now by other hands, its rows of apple trees heavy with the particular sweetness of a place that had once sheltered 2 lonely souls long enough for them to become, against every hard history the world had handed either of them, exactly what the other had always needed and never quite dared to hope for. And ahead of them, mile after mile, the pilgrim road wound on through shrine and wayhouse and mountain pass alike, safer now than it had been in a generation, walked by a woman who had once called herself the last of something broken, and a man who had shown her, one small brave choice at a time, that she could be the first of something whole instead. Together, always now together, chasing whatever came next, side by side, exactly as they meant to remain for every mile of road still left to walk.